The first song of our song service this morning will be number 178, 178. I will sing the wondrous story. Sing all three verses as written. I will sing the wondrous story of the Christ who died for me. How he left his home in glory for the cross of Calvary. Yes, I'll sing the wondrous story of the Christ who died for me. Sing it with the saints in glory, gathered by the crystal sea. I was lost, but Jesus found me, found the sheep that went astray. Threw his loving arms around me, drew me back into his way. Yes, I'll sing a wondrous story of the Christ who died for me. Sing it with the saints in glory, gathered by the crystal sea. He will keep me till the river rolls its waters at my feet. Then he'll bear me safely over where the loved ones I shall meet. Yes, I'll sing a wondrous story of the Christ who died for me. Sing it with the saints in glory, counted by the crystal sea. We're continuing
our study in Matthew's Gospel this morning, coinciding with the song we just sang about the wondrous story of the Christ who died for me. That's what we've been covering in this portion of Matthew's Gospel, the events leading up to Christ dying for us. And in particular, we want to focus our attention at the end of Matthew chapter 26 for a few minutes this morning, as we look at the fact that many false witnesses came forward when Jesus was tried. As we begin again to think about these things, notice with me in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 26, at the beginning of the chapter, we find that the plot to kill Jesus took shape in Jerusalem. Jesus had entered Jerusalem, as we read in Matthew chapter 21. He went on to have a series of public discussions in the temple courts with ones who were trying to trap him in his words. He had a private discussion with his apostles on the Mount of Olives following that, where he talked about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the eventual passing away also of the heavens and the earth, and his judgment of mankind, which would happen on the last day. But what we see here in Matthew 26 is that Jesus was not caught unaware. He was not surprised that there were those who were plotting to kill him. He said to his disciples in verse 2, "You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." The account in Matthew goes on to reveal the hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders, his enemies. and the underhanded tactics to which they were willing to stoop as they involved Judas in their plan, and the transaction between the chief priest and Judas, giving him 30 pieces of silver to betray the Lord. The Passover here provided the occasion for his crucifixion. We read on in that section of Matthew 26, the things that went on between Jesus and his disciples as they were eating, as he introduced the Lord's Supper to them, but he also informed them of the betrayal. And he said that one of them would betray him. In verse 25 of Matthew 26, Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, "Rabbi, is it I?" He said to him, "You have said it." After identifying Judas as the betrayer, Matthew goes on then to record how Jesus introduced the Lord's Supper to his disciples, and then following that, they went out to the Mount of Olives after having sung a hymn, according to verse 30. Well, as we move forward, we find that the disciples then disappointed the Lord on the night of his betrayal. Knowing that that would transpire, Jesus had warned them that all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night, in verse 31, quoting from Zechariah chapter 13, in which it was said that the shepherd would be stricken and the sheep would be scattered. Peter responded, claiming that he would not stumble even if all the others did. And yet Jesus informed him that before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter even insisted in verse 35, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples. But as we move forward here, following this, he takes the apostles to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. Of course, they keep falling asleep instead of being watchful and praying with him. And after praying that this cup would pass from him, but only in keeping with the Father's will, Matthew goes on to talk about the betrayal unfolding. Verse 46, Jesus tells them, "Let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And then, while he was still speaking in verse 47, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Greeting Jesus with an insincere kiss, Judas then signaled to the mob that Jesus was the one who should be arrested. And so he was arrested in the garden, of course, to allow the prophetic scriptures to be fulfilled. As he said in verse 56, he could have put a stop to this, but he said all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And then all the disciples forsook him and fled. As the events of the night of his betrayal continue to unfold, notice what takes place as Christ moves toward the cross. The next thing that we notice here is that we have him put on trial before the Jewish council. Jesus was taken to the high priest. Following the betrayal and arrest in the garden, Matthew goes on to say in verse 57, "And those who laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled." Even at this late hour in the middle of the night, the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, is willing to assemble under the direction of the high priest to try to take advantage of this opportunity to finally rid themselves of Jesus once and for all. Now, meanwhile, Matthew adds in verse 58, but Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now, the fact, of course, that Peter is observing these proceedings from a distance, that will prove significant, as you know, as the night wears on. But Jesus here is accused by false witnesses. Regarding the proceedings of the council, Matthew goes on to say in verses 59 and 60, "Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. Now, once again, here the true character of these men who were supposed to be the religious and spiritual leaders of the nation, their true character is exposed. What did the law of Moses say about bearing false witness? What was inscribed on the tablets of stone, the Ten Commandments? Going back to Exodus 20 and verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. That was their law. That was what they were supposed to be teaching and upholding. But in spite of that, they had many false witnesses come forward so that they could find some reason for which they might condemn Jesus to death. Now, they didn't have any interest in obeying the law of Moses when it came to matters of truth and justice and mercy, but they were at least careful to abide by Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 15, which says, one witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or sin that he commits, but by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter should be established. You see, they're going to follow that, right? Because they don't just have one false witness come forward, they have many false witnesses come forward. Even as they sought to make sure that they had multiple witnesses in making their case against Jesus, they still had difficulty in finding false testimony that could consistently be used against him. As verse 60 says, even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last, two false witnesses came forward. And these false witnesses said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. These two false witnesses had apparently seized upon and twisted the words of Jesus that we read in John chapter 2 in his first cleansing of the temple in Jerusalem. When they asked him for a sign there in John 2 verses 19 through 21, Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews said it's taken 46 years to build this temple. Will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Apparently these false witnesses twisted those words where Jesus was actually talking about his own physical body and his own resurrection, to put forward the idea that Jesus is saying he's going to go over there and physically tear down the temple of God. And so that's the false testimony to be used against him here as we look at Matthew 26 and verses 59 to 61. But next we have the confession of the Christ. Jesus affirms here his status as the Son of God. Once Caiaphas, the high priest, concludes that the council can build its case on the false testimony of these two false witnesses regarding the temple, Matthew goes on to say, and the high priest arose and said to him, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? In verse 63 it says, but Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now you notice at first Jesus kept silent. That's in keeping with the prophecy from Isaiah 53 and verse 7, where it was said that he was like a sheep before its shears, silent. So he opened not his mouth. But once the high priest charges him to tell them whether or not he is the Christ, if Jesus were to continue to remain silent, that would be viewed as a denial of who he is. If he's not going to affirm that that's the case regarding his identity. And so Matthew records the Lord's response at that point in verse 64. Jesus said to him, it is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, not only does Jesus confess that he is the Christ, the Son of God, but he goes much further in claiming that he is in a completely unique and exalted position compared to all others. Think about it. These wicked men here who make up the Jewish council, they may currently be presiding over him in judgment. But the day will come when those positions will be reversed. That will be flipped. And he will preside over them in judgment. And they will be compelled to acknowledge the truth that he is the great king who rules over all. Well, Jesus was abused, of course, for speaking this truth. Upon hearing his confession that he truly is the Christ, the Son of God, Matthew goes on to say in verses 65 and 66, and the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He's spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look now, you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered and said, "He is deserving of death." To outwardly indicate his outrage at what he has heard Jesus say, the high priest tore his clothes and accuses Jesus of speaking blasphemy. Blasphemy in this context refers to impious and reproachful speech injurious to divine majesty. That's the definition of the term used there according to Thayer's lexicon. And what that's saying is they're accusing Jesus of saying something derogatory about God, about divine majesty, that he would claim that he's in that position. How dare he? Having already disregarded any possibility that Jesus could truly be the Christ and Son of God, Caiaphas and the council seize on this claim as grounds for condemnation deserving of death. Having judged him worthy of death, Matthew writes in verses 67 and 68, "Then they spat in his face and beat him with the palms of their hands, saying, 'Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?'" Matthew doesn't tell us, as Luke does, that they had blindfolded him, and that's why they're asking, "Who is the one who struck you?" But to spit in someone's face would be to heap shame upon that person as a criminal who has no place in society. These dishonest, evil men inflicted that very treatment upon the Son of God himself as he stood in their midst. I don't know if you've ever had anyone spit in your face. I hope not. But think about the insult. Think about the abuse. Not only that, but they physically beat him with their own hands and ridiculed him in the process. Well, then we come to the denials of Peter. Peter lied concerning his connection to Jesus. While Jesus was confessing to the council that he was the Christ, one of his closest disciples was at the same time denying his own connection to the Christ. In verses 69 and 70, we read, "Now Peter sat outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him, saying, 'You also were with Jesus of Galilee.' But he denied it before them all, saying, 'I do not know what you're saying.'" The first denial is in response to a servant girl pointing out that Peter had been with Jesus. Next, Matthew goes on to say in verses 71 and 72, "And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, 'This fellow also is with Jesus of Nazareth.' But again he denied with an oath, 'I do not know the man.'" In response to another girl here who identified him as being a follower of Jesus, he again denies his connection to Christ, but this time with an oath. This time with an oath. Now, not only did he lie and reject his connection to Christ, but in the process, he also rejected the teaching that he had received from Christ. Because Jesus had said, going back to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, "Do not swear at all," in verse 34. And Peter here just goes ahead and disregards that as well. When accused the third time, notice what happens. In verses 73 and 74, back to Matthew 26. A little later, those who stood by came up to Peter and said, "Surely you also are one of them, for your speech betrays you." Then he began to curse and swear, saying, "I do not know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. When accused a third time of being a follower of Jesus, Peter takes his denial to another level by not only swearing once more to the lie, but he also began to curse, as Matthew says here. Now, that may have involved the use of foul language as we think of cursing, or even a call for condemnation on another person, which means that he may have even cursed Jesus himself, which is almost too horrible to really even consider. And yet that's the level to which Peter may have taken this. This apostle, who had boldly claimed, remember, just a few hours earlier, that he would never be made to stumble and would willingly die for the Lord, quickly denounced him in the fiercest terms when the pressure was on. And as soon as he uttered that third denial, immediately a rooster crowed, just as Jesus had previously prophesied that it would. Peter recognized the shamefulness of his behavior. Directly after denying his connection to Christ for the third time and hearing that rooster crow, verse 75 says, "And Peter remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, 'Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times.' So he went out and wept bitterly." How it must have stung for this apostle, one of the closest followers of Jesus, to suddenly realize just how spineless and how shameful and how disgraceful and how wicked his words had been, as he had forcefully turned his back on the one who had so lovingly taught him and guided him and helped him and had been patient with him all during these past few years of their association together. How that must have stung. Peter remembered the Lord's prediction of his denial. He knew that he had done exactly the thing that he claimed that he would never do. And having realized these things, Matthew says, so he went out and wept bitterly, cried his eyes out over what he had done. No doubt Peter experienced a depth of disappointment in himself that he likely never dreamed possible prior to the events of this tragic night. And so here we see in this section of Matthew's gospel, Jesus' trial before the Jewish council, in which he confesses that he is the Christ, that he is the Son of God. We also see the sad denials of Peter, one of his closest apostles, disavowing any connection to him in those dark moments. As many false witnesses came forward to falsely accuse the Son of God. Having condemned him on the basis of his claim to be the Christ, these evil men mocked and beat and humiliated the Lord, the one who allowed himself to be treated in this manner so that he could fulfill the Father's will, even as he remained faithful to his mission in the face of this kind of treatment from his enemies. The Lord was faithful all the way through to the end, knowing that even his closest followers weren't there for him when it mattered most. We think about how he loved us enough to follow through to the fullest extent in order to serve as our Savior who can take away our sins. We have to think about ourselves. Will we serve this one who subjected himself to such things to secure our salvation? And of course, we hope the answer to that question is yes, we will. Yes, we will. There's no one worth following other than him. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention, for following along and participating. We will end our lesson there for the moment, and we'll take just a few minutes now to get ready for our Bible.